Hi, this is going to be a bit of a challenge for me because we know how much I like to talk and the sun sets in 20 minutes, so let's see if I can get this all done. It's a highly requested video, which is why I wanted to film it. My glasses are a bit distracting so you kind of can see the reflection. God, no, I feel like I can't see. I don't wear my glasses that often, and then when I remember to wear them, when I take them off, I'm like, God, I'm actually really blind, so I'm gonna put them back on. Please excuse my bed. It is washing day. The House of Benoni. Let's get started. I'm gonna go through what my favourite podcasts are, why I love them and what I've learned from them. I listen to everything on the podcast app. The purple one, that one. So number one is gonna be probably no shock to anyone. It is The Guilty Feminist. So it's hosted by Deborah Frances-White. In the earlier episodes, it's also hosted by Sophie Hagen. Both comedians, they're amazing. Sophie Hagen's podcast is another one which I'm gonna talk about. The premise of the podcast is, it starts off in the earlier episodes talking about how non-diverse you'll often find comedy panels are. For example, if you watch 8 out of 10 Cats, Mock the Week, those kind of programs, often there'll be a token woman. There's a lot of white men cracking jokes. Deborah goes on to say about how in the industry it's very, very difficult to find a lot of women being offered a lot of jobs at the same rate as men. It's really funny because at the beginning of every episode they'll be like, I'm a feminist, but you might have seen on my Instagram story that sometimes I'll be like, I'm a feminist, but I really enjoy training to misogynistic music. It's just unpicking those little paradoxes within our lives, that even as much as you might associate yourself with being a feminist, someone who believes in equality for everyone, it doesn't mean that you're not sometimes doing stuff which is maybe a little bit hypocritical or a little bit out of whack with what your kind of political beliefs are. It makes certain situations lighthearted. It's really topical. I've learned a lot about transphobia, homophobia. I feel like I'm a lot more understanding of intersexual feminism, about the fluidity of gender, the fluidity of sexuality. Listening to this podcast, not only is it hilarious, but it's given me a much wider understanding on other social issues which I wasn't necessarily that well versed in, because I wasn't necessarily coming across people who were discussing it, or people maybe just don't talk about it that much. So I think the podcast is really incredible for normalising some taboo subjects and also just things which are important to learn. There is also bits on racism, sexism. Obviously it's a feminist podcast, it deals with a lot of feminist issues, so that has to be my favourite one. I think every single episode I've learned something. I always then go on to look onto the special guests because they're obviously really incredible, really intelligent and have a lot to say. So through the medium of comedy, they basically teach you a lot about the world, and I think it's an absolutely incredible podcast. I'd love to go and see it live. Number 2 on my list is Desert Island Discs. I remember when I used to be in the car on the way to school, my parents would always listen to Radio 4. Desert Island Discs, Just a Minute, Women's Hour, all of those things are things that I now listen to fervently and absolutely love. And Desert Island Discs is such a good podcast. Kirsty Young, I don't know if you've ever listened to her, but she talks like, my name is Kirsty Young and welcome to Desert Island Discs. Oh, she's just got the nicest voice and she's really good at getting information out of people, but in a really lovely way. Some of my favourites on Desert Island Discs are Stephen Fry, really good episode, Hugh Bonneville. Davina McCall's is fascinating and really interesting to hear about how much of a tumultuous life she'd had. I didn't actually realise that. Ed Sheeran's is really good, David Beckham's is good, so there's a lot of really notable people that go on that. I think when you go on Desert Island Discs, that's kind of when you know you've made it. And they basically pick tracks that they would take to a desert island. They explain the reason behind the songs. Mickey Flanagan was on the other day, and so it's really interesting hearing from all these different people who are now in the scope of celebrity, but Kirsty Young takes them back and you learn a lot about their childhood and their life, their ethos on different things. I'm gonna pick The High-Low. So The High-Low, oh, I love it. It's Pandora Sykes and Dolly Alderton, who both used to write for the Sunday Times Style. They had their podcast previously, which I'd also recommend, called Pandolly. Just really funny. They worked well together, discussed loads of things from the Kardashians to Trump to North Korea. There's always some kind of topical incentive that they've picked up on, but whether it be like Harvey Weinstein, but then they'll also talk about why cardigans are back in fashion and how you can wear a cardigan and make it look good. So they're incredibly well read and they always suggest really good books as well. So that's a really good thing if you're looking to find something to read. I would say that much like The Guilty Feminist, what it does is it offers information to you kind of in layman's terms, but also in an enjoyable manner. So it means that maybe if you're not someone who necessarily reads the news or watches the news, it's a good way to get up to speed on what's going on in the world, but without finding it too boring or something that you're not necessarily interested in. Really quite educational. So that is fantastique. Number 4, we have Under the Skin with Russell Brand. Oh, I love all of these podcasts so much. Russell Brand's podcast usually comes from talking about a more ideological point of view, so often he has a spiritual spin on things and he likes to delve into the motives behind people doing things, how you find oneness with yourself. The most recent one was with Ed Stafford. He did a really interesting talk about how he went off into the wilderness or somewhere for 60 days on his own, and they talked about how your sense of self is created by the people around you. So we basically take notes and understand feedback from people around us reacting to our personality, and that's how you conjure up this idea of your sense of self. But when you're on your own, actually that can be really quite terrifying because it breaks down all these ideas that you have, because everything we have is kind of like an amalgamation of other people's feedback to us. That's the kind of idea that they usually talk about. He discusses a lot about politics, about different social issues, talks about government quite a lot, and talks about different ways that we could perhaps be a better nation, or that other countries could work better together as humans. And just, it's quite anthropological. I can't really feel like I can't articulate it well enough, because Russell Brand's so articulate. Although I will say that sometimes I do find he has quite an agenda when he talks to people, and he gets some really intellectual and amazing guests on. But it is very much still kind of like the Russell Brand show, which isn't a bad thing because I really like him. Personality is certainly completely translated. It's not like some other podcasts, they just interview and it's all about the person on the podcast. It's very much Russell Brand with guest. There's a lot of thought experiments and delving into ways that we look at violence, or the way that we structure our familial situations. There's a lot to work with there. Again, very educational. Number 5 is Global Pillage. This is also Deborah Frances-White, #fangirl. The diversity panel show. There was lots of different opinions coming in from such a diverse panel, and basically it's really funny actually. Some teams, I think, of 3, Deborah's hosting it, and they're one team, another team, and the audience is the hive mind, which is the 3rd team. The best round is the idioms round, so they translate an idiom from a different language and you have to try and work out what that idiom is. For example, an example of an idiom would be a chip on your shoulder. Obviously, if you literally translated that into another language and you'd never heard of that before, you might either think of literally like a potato fry on your shoulder, or like obviously a chip out of your shoulder. It actually makes no logical sense, so it's really interesting when you translate things from different countries. One that I found really funny the other day was actually, in the UK obviously we say go Dutch, which means you're sharing the bill, but in other countries sometimes they say go American, go Swedish. Strange to think about because we're so accustomed to these little nuances of our own language that we forget that that doesn't necessarily translate perfectly across the board. So it does make you realise how much we are sheltered to be so fixed in our own society and not really necessarily look outside of where we're from. I think it's really cool, learn a lot from that, and it's always really hilarious. And yeah, it's Deborah, so just, you know, it's going to be one of my faves. I think we're at number 6. Number 6. Okay, Made of Human podcast with Sophie Hagen, who is the Danish comedian that I was saying is in the earlier ones of Guilty Feminist. She is a fat woman, which she talks about a lot. She's anti-fat phobia, the way that actually it's an ideology that we want to be skinny, and why being fat isn't this awful thing that society thinks it is. And that's taught me a lot about fat shaming. She's really made me understand the way that actually our society is unduly cruel to people who are overweight, when you don't necessarily give that same kind of treatment to other people. It's just because being fat, it's visible, and it's something which we have deemed as a society to be disgusting or outrageous, and really it's not that. So that's just one of the things I've taken from Sophie. Also talks a lot about mental health, very openly about mental health, mental struggles. He has really interesting guests on, a lot of comedians as well, and they often discuss really important topics. And at the end of every podcast she asks them, like, what is something that you would tell your baby self, and that's always quite an interesting segment right at the end. It's all just about how we're all made of human, we're all the same thing, with the same entity, and why we're so cruel to each other, and exploring people, which I think is probably, like, I find it absolutely fascinating, just the study of why we're like what we're like, what makes us tick, what makes us drive. And she just gets inside people's heads and asks them sometimes really quite deep personal questions, but it's always a really good conversation. And she can be quite polemical. She often says things which maybe people would think are a bit outrageous, but I really like Sophie. Is My Dad Wrote a Porno. Now, if none of you guys have listened to this, it is hilarious. And there's 2 guys and a girl, and one of the guys' dads literally wrote like erotic fiction, which is horrendous. It's so bad. And they basically just read out like a chapter each week, and really famous, so you guys have probably heard of it. They do like live tours and everything, but it is just so funny. Read it out and then like commentate on it, and they have footnotes with special guests at the end. And that, honestly, like the first season, I remember I used to go to the gym and do my list, and I'd honestly be crying with laughter on the treadmill, but have like my wireless headphones on and just be walking, like looking straight forward, and I'm like, ah! Rude as well, obviously, some of it, so that's quite funny. Oh god, I've got loads. So the next one I would have to say is Homo Sapiens. So this is with Will Young and Christopher Sweeney, and they just talk to people over like tea and biscuits. It's also a lot to do with the LGBTQ community. That's kind of like the angle that they're trying to come in at, and also just to, again, normalise the idea of being queer or being gay or whatever it might be, and to just get more LGBTQ voices out there. So they do discuss some really important topics. They had a sex worker talking, and they had kind of the two sides of sex work, people who really enjoy it, and just getting maybe a few taboo subjects or things which still even now in 2017 aren't overly talked about out there into people's minds, getting you thinking about it, and just introducing some newer concepts. But also they're just both really lovely guys. I find that to be a really comforting podcast, especially like in the evening if you just want to listen and hang out with some friends. It's kind of like you've got a couple of mates with you. And then Millennial Love. So this is actually my friend Livy's podcast, writer for The Independent, bridging the gap for people who are in their 20s, so millennials, and talking about how dating in this newfound age of dating apps and all these random words like ghosting and sharking and whatever else, I can't remember the terms now, so down with the kids. And they're really funny and really dynamic conversation with them, and they often have a guest sharing and swapping really funny stories. And they also had someone from Bumble come on the other day and talk about the best way to improve your dating app and how dating has changed. So really interesting, and obviously it's my friend, so I like having her talking in my ears because I'm like, oh hi Liv, you right? And then yeah, that's nice. It's literally about to get dark in 2 minutes. So I'm gonna cut this little video off here. Sorry, I blatantly talked so quickly because I just wanted to get it all out. But I hope you found that useful, and I'll put the links to all the podcasts below, and I will probably do another one next month about what podcasts I'm listening to then, because I do have other ones I listen to, but those are probably like my faves at the mo. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon for another cup of little little chat. Okay, bye!